Today we're finally getting to the transcendental deduction of the categories. By far the most important and influential section of the critique of pure reason, perhaps, in our entire course. There are two versions of it in both the first edition, the A version, and the B edition. Both are equally important. Today we're going to be looking at the A version of the transcendental deduction. So we're still answering that same question. How are synthetic a priori propositions possible? How can you know about the world before you look? And we already know the answer is going to be some transcendental conditions, a filter on experience. The only way we can know what's in that room before we look is if there's a bouncer in front of the room restricting what gets into it. We've already talked about the bouncer, the transcendental condition that sensibility puts on our experience. The transcendental aesthetic, those are space and time. And those are the basis of the synthetic a priori propositions of mathematics, of geometry and arithmetic. The transcendental deduction of the categories is going to be the proof that there are also filters that come from the understanding that are responsible for the synthetic a priori propositions of natural science. So not only is there a filter on our sensibility, but there's a filter on our experience that comes from the understanding. And those are going to be the a priori or pure concepts. So there were pure intuitions, space and time, which were the burned-in structure of the grid by which we broke up our experience of the world into a manifold of separate intuitions, and therefore everything that we perceived had to be in space and time. We're going to see that there are general pure concepts burned into our understanding, so that every experience that we have of an object, of a real object, is going to have to be in accordance with these pure a priori concepts that are called the categories. So today we're starting on the section called the transcendental logic. Remember, the transcendental aesthetic was the filter that comes from the sensibility. Now we're looking at the filter that comes from the understanding, the pure a priori concepts that form the basis of natural science and the laws of nature rather than mathematics. And the transcendental deduction of the categories comprises most of this section called the transcendental analytic, that analyzes what exactly the pure concepts are, what are the filters that our understanding imposes on all experience, and how can we finally answer Hume's argument about the validity of causality in the sciences. So Kant thinks that in the transcendental logic he's resolved the conflict between empiricism and rationalism. An empirical intuition would be the sense data we get from our senses. And we saw that pure intuitions are space and time. They're the filters, the grid on which all of our intuitions have to be placed. Empirical concepts would be rules for the constructing of experience. So we have a concept of a dog or a cat or a tree that allows us to construct the data we get from our eyes and ears and noses and our senses into an object. But just as there's a grid of space and time that exists before all of the objects that come into, or all of the sense intuitions that come into our senses, so there's going to be sort of a schematic concept of an object in general that is going to be the pure concepts. So Kant thinks that both ideas and concepts are a necessary component. His famous statement was, without sensibility, no object would be given to us. Without understanding, no object would be thought. So the objects are given to us in sensibility, but they're thought by us and put together in the understanding. So thoughts without content are empty, But intuitions without concepts are blind. So without the senses, our thoughts would be empty. Without concepts, our intuitions or sense perceptions would be blind, would be just unstructured data. So we're going to be interested mostly in the transcendental deduction of the categories. But there's an earlier section in which Kant deduces what the categories actually are. That's called the metaphysical deduction. And in that section, even though we won't go into it in too much detail, Kant is going to lay the basis for an entire movement of 20th century philosophy called analytic philosophy, because he thinks that you can trace out, how are we going to figure out what the filter on our experience is. Kant thinks the only way to read off the structure of our experience, the structure of reality that we impose upon our experience, is to look at the structure of language. The structure of a judgment that has a subject and a predicate is the type of synthesis, the type of putting together or construction that goes on in experience. And the type of synthesis or construction between subjects and predicates in language is going to mirror or be the guide to the structure of our experience that's imposed by the categories. So Kant makes a couple moves that are going to be foundational to the analytic movement in philosophy in the 20th century. He's going to think that the structure of reality follows the structure of language. And he's going to think that for the first time that the unit of representation is not a single idea, not a picture in the mind, as everyone in the representational model of knowledge has thought, but is a sentence in which you get the combination of a number of ideas, a subject and a predicate put together or synthesized. And we'll see that that's going to be the basis of understanding reality in terms of the logical structure of our sentences, rather than the connection between our senses and the world. So this is another aspect of Kant's Copernican revolution. So remember that the categories are going to have lots of names, and it might be useful for you to get clear about them. So in the metaphysical deduction, we're going to trace out what are the categories, what are the concepts of an object in general, sort of the schematic structure, the container for any object. And then your empirical concept will tell you whether that object is a tree or a horse or a dog. You might want to think of, if you see something in the distance or in the dark, you'll first of all know it's an object before you know what it is. The categories are going to be those pure concepts, those schematic containers of all objects in general that are going to act as a filter for the understanding. They're going to act as a transcendental condition, a bouncer that will keep anything out of our experience that doesn't meet those transcendental conditions or doesn't fit into that general container of an object in general. So, in some ways, the metaphysical deduction that we just talked about is the source of all of the philosophical tradition of England and America in the 20th century, which is called the analytic tradition, which focuses on analysis of language, and like Hume, tries to deconstruct philosophical problems by showing how they can be reduced to their parts, and see how you can make more clear the problems that philosophers deal with as arising from a lack of clarity in language. The philosophy of France and Germany and the rest of continental Europe during the 20th century is called continental philosophy. And we'll see it's based upon the type of transcendental phenomenological method that we'll see introduced most clearly in the B deduction of the categories that we'll talk about next time. So Kant is a unique philosopher in that he can be said to be the founder of two separate 20th century philosophical traditions. Both the analytic and the continental tradition trace their pedigree back to Kant. And it's Kant's metaphysical deduction, his deduction of the structure of reality and thought from the structure of language, and his identification of the unit of meaning as the sentence or the judgment with a subject and a predicate, and the different logical ways of combining subjects and predicates that makes him the father of analytic philosophy. So you don't need to know this for the exam, but these are the judgments and the categories that form the basis of what's called the metaphysical deduction of the categories, which is just Kant figuring out what are the pure concepts of an object in general. The transcendental deduction we're going to see is going to be a different type of enterprise, showing that you can be sure that they really are a universal filter on all of our experience, showing that they really do apply. So the judgments are the different ways of combining a subject and a predicate. So if we're saying dogs and mammals, we can say all dogs are mammals, a universal judgment. We can say some dog is a mammal, or I can make a singular statement and say this dog, Fido, is a mammal. I can say it in lots of different ways. I can affirm it and say it is a mammal. I can say it's not a mammal. I can say that some of them are not mammals. The class of not mammals would be an infinite class of everything in the world that's not a mammal. I can say it categorically and say it is true. I can say it hypothetically and say if this is true, then something else is true. I can say either or, which is a disjunction. And I can state it in terms of different types of modalities. I can say it's possible that it's true. I can say it's actually true. Or I can say it's necessarily true. So these are just the different ways that logically I can combine a subject and a predicate. And Kant is going to say that those different schematic logical ways in language of combining a subject and predicate are the different schematic ways in which our mind might synthesize an object. They form the template of an object in general. So these function sort of differently than the filters of the sensibility. Everything had to be in space and time. But not everything has to be unity, plurality, or totality, which is the category of quantity. It just has to be one of those three. It has to be one of these three of quality, one of these, or one of these. So everything, we can experience a reality as a unity, as one thing, or we can experience as a flock of birds, or we can experience it as a totality. Probably the most important of the categories are these ones. Inherence and subsistence. That's our category of substance. We'll perceive an object. We always perceive an object as a substance with properties. The most important is going to be cause and effect. Kant thinks that the causal relationships and cause and effect are part of the very definition of an object itself. So we build causality into the object as part of our construction of the object. That's why we can be certain that the sun will rise, that the cup, if I let go of it, will fall, because it wouldn't get into my experience unless it followed the laws of causality. So these categories are read right off of the different logical structures of judgment, and they form the templates of an object in general. You don't have to know these particular table of categories. They're probably the least important thing that we're going to talk about today. Almost no one after Kant is going to think that this particular list of categories is actually what all rational creatures use as the template for an object in general. Instead, it's going to be the way in which Kant traces out the structures and activities of ourself and of our cognitive faculties. That's going to be the most important part of Kant's philosophy. And that's the transcendental deduction of the categories. The way that Kant is using the term deduction is a little bit strange. It may help to see what its history is. A deduction is a type of legal proof or legal maneuver where you show that a particular law or a particular legal concept is applicable to a particular case. So when we do the deduction of the categories, we're showing that the categories can be applied universally to every experience. This is called the objective validity of the categories, which means that everything that can get into our experience, every objective reality, every object that we would call real, has to be in accordance with the categories. So the transcendental deduction is a deduction or a proof of the objective validity of the categories, which means that it's a proof that all objective experience will be in accordance with the categories and the laws of physics that arise from the category of causality. And the method by which Kant is going to prove it is going to be very important as well. It's called a transcendental argument. An argument, as we mentioned before, that attempts to get beyond experience by seeing what the necessary conditions of what we do experience are. Remember, you start from some fact of experience and then say that this other thing is the only way in which that could be possible, and therefore I can conclude or prove or deduce that B is the case, even though I can't actually see it. Remember, our example is we've got a room with no doors and windows, but with a doorbell. I hear the doorbell ring. That's my fact of experience. I've ruled out all the other possible causes of the doorbell, so therefore having somebody at the door who I can't see is the only way that A can be possible. Therefore, I can infer that that thing which transcends my experience really exists. And we mentioned before the strange irony or paradox that the transcendental deduction are in some sense exceptions to the whole point of the critique of pure reason. The critique of pure reason tries to show that it's impossible to apply our concepts outside of our experience. It's impossible for us to know noumena, or anything that transcends our experience. But in the transcendental deduction, we get to know something outside of our experience, the nature of ourself, the nature of our cognitive faculties, the nature of that spontaneity, Kant calls it, through which our understanding and imagination constructs experience. We can't see it. We can never experience that inner or transcendental ego or self. All we can do is try to deduce what's going on in it through seeing its actions in our experience. So the A deduction is often called the psychological deduction, whereas the B version that we'll talk about next time is sometimes called the logical deduction. We'll see why. The A deduction concentrates on the psychological faculties that must be in our mind to explain the different features of our experience. So it starts with the premise that we have experience. And here's a very important definition for you. Experience for Kant is just knowledge of objects by means of connected representations. So when we know an object, we actually construct it or synthesize it, put it together by putting together those connected representations. Remember the subject and predicate of language, which is a guide to how our experience is. I experience a brown pencil, and I put together the pencil is brown, those two properties. I see a piece of paper on my desk. I put together the subject and the predicate. The paper is on the desk. Every bit of experience is always some knowledge of some objects that are constructed through connected representations. So that's the fact from which the transcendental deduction begins. And the argument is going to be that the connections that we find in experience have to be come from some agency or some synthesis. If there's a synthesis or connection in our experience, if our experience just is the connection of different representations, somehow they got put together, there must be some agency, something which has done the connecting, which has done the synthesizing. So there's a synthesizing agency that accounts for all self-conscious experience. Kant will call that an apperception. Apperception, we'll see that term later, is the fact that I can append an I think to each of our experiences. So there's some agency, which is my thinking, which has put together each of my experiences. And the fact that that's necessary means that those categories, which are the different forms, the different templates of an object in general, must be applied to every single experience. There are going to be three different versions or aspects of the A deduction. Three different syntheses that represent the different types of syntheses that go on in the sensibility, in the imagination, and the understanding. Now here we have to be careful, because remember, we can't use our words to describe the transcendental syntheses. They're noumenal agencies, somehow outside of our mind and our real self. And Kant is clear that even though he's deducing them separately and talking about them separately, they're not really, you shouldn't think of them as this happens first, and then this is second, and then this is third. Remember, time only applies to things within experience. This is the plumbing behind the scenes that makes up experience. So it's not as if this is happening in order. In fact, Kant says these are really just three different aspects of the same spontaneity that we at one time recognize as this synthesis, and then is this synthesis, and then is this synthesis. So before we talk about the actual deduction, actual transcendental deduction, it's important to recognize that it's strange what we're proving the existence of. All we know is it's some type of agency, and we can only know it by what it does. And we're always misled when we try to draw conclusions from our empirical concepts to talk about this stuff without that goes beyond our experience. Yet, strange as it may seem, a transcendental deduction allows us to get at this unknown and unseeable spontaneity in ourselves. And that's the only way we know ourselves, is through the way in which every experience comes along with this I think, this evidence of the spontaneity of ourself that was used to put it together. So wherever there's knowledge, which is connected representations, there must be an agency which is doing the synthesis or doing the connecting. That's the basic principle of the transcendental deduction. And again, this is an example of Kant's Copernican revolution. Instead of asking, how can we have knowledge, he starts with the fact that we have necessary and universal knowledge of causality. And then he concludes that the only way that would be possible is if we were able to get that from knowledge, get that from our own imposition. If it was our own agency that was a bouncer imposing it on our experience, our own spontaneity, necessarily putting objects together in accordance with these rules. And in this passage, you can see him talking about Locke and Hume, saying Locke didn't take this into account, thought he could get the concepts from experience, but then Kant thinks he attempted to use them to describe things like substance and God and the soul and abstract ideas that go beyond anything we could actually see. Hume recognized that you have to have an a priori origin of these things, but thought that it was impossible to get it from experience. So he thought that the only necessity we could get for causality was the subjective necessity from custom and habit. So Kant thinks he's going to answer Locke and Hume by showing this transcendental argument that shows that because we see connections within our experience, we can deduce that there must be some type of connecting agency with certain properties, and that those properties will guarantee that the categories will be applied as the concept of an object in general to every one of our experiences. So the first synthesis, or sometimes Kant calls it a synopsis, a pulling together, holding together, is the synthesis of apprehension in sensibility. And this just points to the fact that we have one experience in which objects in space and time are all presented together. It would only be possible for us to have one experience if we gather this manifold or manyness of sense data together into the mind. Of course, that's not necessary. It might have been the case that we had two minds or two places that our sense experiences come together, and our right hand never knew what our left hand was doing, or our right eye never knew what our left eye was doing. So, insofar, Kant says, as the different things are contained in a single moment, the unity of intuition has to be first run through and held together, and he calls this the synthesis of apprehension. So we have two eyes. The fact that we get one experience means that there must be some place where the input from this eye and the input from this eye come together. Now it's easier for us to understand what Kant meant by the synopsis of apprehension and sensibility, because we're aware of the way in which we have two hemispheres of our brain that communicate through a number of different bands of nerves, the most important of which is this central band of nerves called the corpus callosum. And in some people, because of an epileptic fit or because of other brain surgeries, the corpus callosum is severed so that the two hemispheres of the brain can no longer communicate. And under those conditions, literally the right hand and the left hand won't know what the other is doing. There is no synthesis of apprehension. The different senses don't all end up in the same place, aren't all collected together into one consciousness. So the synthesis of apprehension and sensibility just points to the fact that we have one place in consciousness, one place where all of our sense data are put together. We don't have a separate mind for our hands and our tongue and our ears and our two eyes. All of that sense data gets put together, so we have an experience where we can hear, see, feel, touch, taste things all sort of on one stage in one place. The second synthesis is called the synthesis of reproduction in the imagination. This is a particularly important one because time is going to turn out to be very important as the condition of our inner sense, of our putting together of our own consciousness. So imagination is perceiving objects and events that take time and are continuous over time. Therefore, it must be reproducing events and holding them in existence while the subsequent events happen. Kant's example is drawing a line. If I were to draw a line across the page, if the first part of the line wasn't maintained and then held together with the second part of the line and then held together with the third part of the line, you could never see the line as being drawn. Of course, each moment of time is separate. This part of the first part of the line and this part of the line and the end of the line all happen at different instants or moments in time. Unless there were sort of a short-term memory buffer that reproduced this moment and held it together with this moment and held it together with this moment, it would be impossible to have experience of unified objects in time. So the synthesis of reproduction of imagination is the necessary condition of experiencing extended objects in time. And here are some examples of that. You may not be able to see these images moving unless you look at the actual slideshow. But this is an image, a GIF, of a guy waving his hand. And maybe we've seen when somebody waves their hand, you see that motion, you see their hand sort of existing in two different places at once. If you move it really fast, it's like a continuous blur. The only way, in that case, it's obvious that the only way you could see the hand sort of in two places as they're waving it back and forth is if your imagination was reproducing and holding the first image of the hand and holding it together with the second image of the hand. This example is just the example of drawing the line that Kant made. Unless we reproduced and maintained this image, we wouldn't be able to have feel and experience the continuous drawing of the line from one side to the other. And this video is just a simple little kids musical video of row, row, row your boat. In order to experience that musical phrase or that musical melody, I have to somehow reproduce and hold in my mind the first row, and then the second row, and then the third row. So we get row, row, row. And unless I were somehow remembering and holding in my mind the first row, I wouldn't hear the melody. I would just be hearing, if you were Mr. Short-Term Memory, it didn't have the synthesis of reproduction and imagination, you would just hear me saying row, and then row. But you hear me saying row, row, row because you're capable of reproducing the first row and holding it together with the second and the third as a continuous musical phrase. So that's the synthesis of reproduction in imagination. So again, these are some type of transcendent agency or spontaneity which we can deduce must be happening in order to explain how we have the types of connected experiences that we have. And these types of connections are going to guarantee that the modes of connection, which are the categories, must be applied to every experience. And this idea of reproducing and pulling yourself together in time became the basis of an entire movement in American philosophy called process philosophy, which is associated with the thought of Alfred North Whitehead, who was originally an English philosopher but moved to America, to Harvard, at the latter part of his life. So his process philosophy is associated with American philosophy. And it's become an entire movement in theology as well. There's a movement called process theology that understands God as this moving event or moving occasion, continually remembering the past, tying it together with the present, and looking forward to the future, and sees the fundamental units of being not as objects, but as the movements or the dripping of drops, which involves this same type of essential process or existence in time that is the synthesis of reproduction in the imagination. So process philosophy takes that idea of synthesis in time and makes it the fundamental metaphysical category, and says instead of everything being made of atom, things are made of occasions of synthesis or occasions of experience that Whitehead calls actual occasions. You don't need to know about process philosophy, but you can see how one little part of the transcendental deduction of the first version gives rise to an entire movement in philosophy based upon this novel idea of synthesis of ourselves in time. The last synthesis is by far the most important. It's called the synthesis of recognition by means of concepts. So, in order to perceive an object, I have to recognize it, and recognizing it means that I actually construct the experience according to some rule. And in the case of a pure concept, the template or the general container for an object, Kant calls the transcendental object equals X. You know, the X is just like the schema for an object in general. So, the fact that every experience requires a concept to pull it together, and that before it becomes a rock or a table or a dog or a chair, it has to be an object in general, means that those general properties of general modes of connection in language that are the categories must be applied to every object that exists. So, the evidence for this is the way in which our experience of objects involves perceptual gestalts. So I'm going to give you lots of examples of ways in which you can see that what Kant's main thesis says is in some way obviously true, that we construct our experience by the application of concepts that allow us to construct an object out of unstructured sense data. So if we look at this image here, how many horses do you see? Note that in this case, the data from the horses, all the brown and white patches, are sort of glommed and mixed together, so it's hard for you to construct the objects correctly. But in order to see the horse, you have to recognize it, and that means you have to put it together using the concept of a horse to figure out, oh, that's the nose. So maybe you don't see all 5 of them. There's one here, one there, one there, one there, and then there's a central one here. And you have to learn to use that concept of a horse to see this and construct it as an ear and a nose and an eye for the shape of the horse head. So when you look at this figure, maybe you just see rocks. But then maybe you can also apply the concept of a face and see a face and a couple praying hands here laying on their side. And maybe you can see another shape of a child's face and their praying hands on their side as well. Note that you didn't see those objects. They didn't exist. The mother and the child there praying didn't exist when you didn't see them in your experience, just like the horse here wasn't there on the screen until you actually constructed it and made your mind construct and see the horse and recognize it. So perhaps you wouldn't see anything here. All you'd see would be sense data or the intuitions that were in your mind. You have to apply the concept of dog to see this as the outline of a Dalmatian dog. And there's its legs, and there's its snout in the water drinking from a puddle, and there's its ear and its collar and the outline of its body there. So until your mind performs the activity of constructing it, you don't actually see the dog. This is some patterns of light and shadow that were supposedly in the snow outside of a guy's garage. You're supposed to be able to see the face of Jesus in it. Note that when you don't see it, if you don't see it, that's instructive, because objects don't just appear, don't just come to you from your senses. Your mind has to construct the objects according to your concepts. By recognizing and constructing that object, synthesizing it in accordance with that concept. So this is the outline of the face right here. Here's the eye and the eye. There's the nose. There's the chin glinting. There's the hair and the full beard. There's his shoulders and a cloak going over his shoulders. Maybe you can see it better in this version. There's the outline of the face. An eye in shadow, another eye, the nose, and there's the mouth and the beard and the hair right there. So perhaps before I helped you see it, got you to apply your face concept to organize that experience and recognize it, you didn't see anything there. Do you see anything here? When we turn it right side up, now you may see it automatically as a picture of the United States. Satellite picture of at night. There's Cape Cod and there's Boston. Here we are somewhere up here. There's Florida. Do we see anything when you look at this one? This one may be one of the better examples. Many people don't see anything here, just some light and some shadow. But once you see it, once you see the cow, it's so obvious that it's there. Your mind constructing the cow according to the cow concept creates what psychologists call a perceptual gestalt, a whole that's synthesized, a knowledge of an object through connected experience that's synthesized into a whole that only comes into existence when your mind performs that act of synthesis, or that act of connection. So there you can sort of see the outline of the cow's head. There's its little cow ear. There's another ear. You can see the outline of its snout there, and there's a little nostril and another little nostril. There's the curve of his nose. There's a cow eye, another eye. His body here, you can see, sort of obscured by a fence, is extending into the distance. Once you see it, it's not even just a fanciful cow picture. It's an actual photograph of a cow. But before your mind performed the activity of synthesis, you didn't see it. So the objects we experience, Kant thinks, are not objects that exist in reality apart from our experience. They're objects that our mind constructs according to concepts. That's what the synthesis of recognition by concepts is. And these examples are facts that allow us to transcendentally deduce that there must be some agency in our mind that's doing the putting together this perceptual gestalt to allow us to see the cow that wasn't there until our mind saw it. Maybe you've seen this image many times, an image that can be seen as either a young woman or an old woman. This image helps you to see the young woman. There's her chin, her nose, her eyelash, and her ear as we look at her face in profile, and her neck with the necklace. Here's the old woman. We can see her big nose and her eye, her chin, and her mouth. Now, if we look at this original figure, you should be able to see it as either the old woman or the young woman. The experience that you have will actually change. The gestalt will actually change when you apply different concepts and construct it in different ways. See it as the young woman. There's her ear. You can see the folds of her ear. There's her neck and her necklace. You can see her cheek and her nose and profile. Now see it as the old woman. Now this becomes the eye of the old woman. You can make out the glint of the pupil and the iris. You can make out her mouth and her chin. The idea is that you're not really just interpreting it differently. Your mind is actually constructing different images. This is a famous one that Ludwig Wittgenstein, the 20th century philosopher, used to illustrate the way that he thought that our reality was dependent upon our concepts. So you can see this as a duck facing to the right or a rabbit facing to the left. Here's a better version. The rabbit is munching on the grass, and there's its rabbit ears. Or it's a duck laying on his back looking up at the clouds, and that's the bill of the rabbit. And note how you interpret that separately. Now we see this as the nostril of the duck, where when we saw it as the rabbit, maybe we saw it as the inside of the ear of the rabbit. This is a famous example called the Necker cube, and it's convincing because you can actually see your image change as the synthesis occurs in different ways. Find the back of the cube. If this is the back of the cube, stare at that square. And if you stare at it, it should come to the front. Or if this is the back of the cube, if you stare at this square, it should pop out front to become the front of the cube. If you stare at the back face of the cube long enough, the cube will keep turning itself inside out. In that case, the gestalt changes, which shows that there's some agency in your mind which is constructing your experience, constructing that object differently. Here's a three-dimensional version of it. You probably see it as a cube with a little cube cut out of it. But if you stare at this central point, it should pop out, and now you should see a small cube floating in front of the larger cube. Again, nothing changed on the screen. What's changed is the way in which your mind is constructing that object according to concepts. That's the synthesis of recognition by means of concepts. Here you see, maybe a bowl of fruit. We turn it over. Are you able to construct it as a weird man's face with his nose and his eyes, big cheeks, lips? Here you see a dog with some a floppy mouth and ears. We turn it upside down. Can you see a cat? There's the cat ears, cat paws, cat mouth and nose. Much better cat than it is a dog. And now you see its body receding in the distance. And again, note that we see actually different images. Here we see you can make out the teeth and the tongue of the dog. Here, the teeth and the tongue are gone, and you see it, the body of the cat receding into the distance. Not interpreting one thing in different ways. You're actually constructing different objects. So there must be a spontaneity in your mind that's synthesizing them according to differing concepts. So the conclusion we should draw from this is that there must be a synthesizing agency that is constructing the object in accordance with concepts. So we know that because there's this synthesizing agency, that there's a synthesis of apprehension and intuition, there's a synthesis of reproduction and imagination, there's a synthesis of recognition by means of concepts in the understanding, we're going to be able to conclude that the categories, the rules of synthesis, the necessary rules of synthesis, will always be true of every experience, because it wouldn't get into our experience unless it passed that test, unless it was in accordance with the law of causality. Just as you couldn't make sense of the cow image before you could see it as a cow, so a set of intuitions that were so chaotic that they didn't follow the laws of physics, they didn't follow the laws of causality, you wouldn't even say anything was there. You would perceive it as weird, chaotic hallucinations, and you wouldn't see it as a real object. Just in the same way we said that if things didn't fit into our objective space and time, we'd see them as hallucinations. So the categories are these pure concepts. They're the concepts of an object in general, the schema, the general container for any object. They're going to be that filter for the understanding that generates the synthetic a priori propositions of science. They're the transcendental object equals X, the schema or general container of an object. So since we know that there's a synthesis going on, the categories are the general structure of any synthesis, so we know that the categories are objectively valid, and that therefore we know ahead of time, before looking, that the categories will apply. And it's this agency, this spontaneity that we've arrived at, which Kant calls the transcendental unity of apperception, the transcendental ego or self. Again, apperception is an I think that is connected to all of our perceptions. We see the connection and we can infer the I think, the synthesizing agency beneath the surface. Now, the second edition version of the Transcendental Deduction is going to start from and concentrate on the nature of this I think and the nature of this unity of apperception. Whereas the psychological deduction, the A version, the first edition of the Transcendental Deduction, concentrated on the syntheses, those three psychological faculties that are somehow involved in our synthesizing agency. The B deduction is going to be called the logical deduction, because it's going to concentrate on the logical conditions of this knowledge of self, or this I think, or transcendental unity of apperception. But remember that all of these are names for the same thing. They're names for the categories. They're names for the transcendental condition that is applied to all of our experience. It allows us to know ahead of time that science will be true.